On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israeli armored columns moved toward battle on 3 separate fronts, and among the tanks advancing into combat were machines that, by every conventional standard, should not have existed anymore. These were Sherman tanks, vehicles designed during the early years of the Second World War, built in American factories before jet aircraft, guided missiles, and nuclear weapons reshaped modern warfare. Their steel hulls had been welded in Detroit and Philadelphia more than 2 decades earlier. Some of them had crossed Europe with Patton's Third Army, others had fought through Italy or island-hopped across the Pacific. Many had later been sold for scrap, abandoned in European junkyards, or written off as obsolete relics of a past war. Yet on that morning, these tanks were moving forward once again, rebuilt, modified, and crewed by soldiers who understood exactly how fragile and outdated their machines were supposed to be. The weapons mounted on these Shermans told an equally strange story. Their guns had been designed in France for tanks that did not even exist when the Sherman first entered combat. Their engines were no longer the original gasoline power plants, many had been replaced with diesel engines sourced from civilian manufacturers. Suspensions had been upgraded, turrets altered, recoil systems reworked, and ammunition redesigned. Nothing about these vehicles matched what American engineers had intended in 1942. They were hybrids, products of necessity, improvisation, and relentless mechanical experimentation carried out in workshops scattered across Israel. Facing them were Arab armored forces equipped with Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks. These were modern machines by any reasonable definition, with sloped armor, powerful 100mm guns, stabilized fire control systems, and night fighting equipment. On paper, the outcome should have been obvious. The Sherman was a museum piece. The T-55 represented the cutting edge of Cold War armored doctrine, exported across 3 continents and backed by Soviet training and tactical theory. Arab crews had trained for months, coached by Soviet advisors who emphasized hull-down positions, coordinated fire, and disciplined maneuver. They outnumbered Israeli armored units and occupied prepared defensive positions. Every technical comparison favored them. What followed over the next 6 days challenged nearly every assumption about how armored warfare actually works. The M for Sherman was never designed to be a timeless weapon. When American planners approved it in 1941, they did not attempt to create the most heavily armored or most powerful tank in the world. Instead, they pursued a philosophy shaped by industrial reality. The United States expected to fight a global war across oceans, continents, and hostile terrain. Tanks would need to be shipped in enormous numbers, repaired far from factories, and kept operational by crews with limited training under combat conditions. Reliability, simplicity, and mass production mattered more than perfection. That philosophy shaped every aspect of the Sherman. It was designed to be built in automobile factories rather than specialized arsenals. 11 major factories produced Shermans during the war, including the Detroit Tank Arsenal operated by Chrysler, which alone manufactured nearly 18,000 vehicles. By the time production ended in 1945, more than 49,000 Shermans had been built. No other Western tank came close to those numbers. The tank had serious flaws, and its crews knew them well. Its armor was thin compared to German Tigers and Panthers, and its early 75mm gun struggled against heavy German armor. To destroy Panthers and Tigers, Sherman crews often had to close to dangerously short ranges or rely on flanking shots. Early models stored ammunition poorly, and when penetrated, the gasoline-powered versions had a frightening tendency to catch fire. American crews grimly nicknamed them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter advertised as lighting every time. British tankers called the same phenomenon brewing up. German soldiers referred to Shermans as Tommy Cookers. Yet these weaknesses existed alongside strengths that mattered more than specifications suggested. The Sherman was mechanically reliable in ways German designs were not. Transmissions that crippled Panther units rarely failed in Shermans. Engines could be replaced in the field within hours. Parts were standardized across factories and production runs. A track link from a Sherman built in Detroit would fit one built in Philadelphia. Logistics officers did not need to worry about incompatible components. The tank could cross bridges too weak for heavier German armor and could be transported easily by rail and ship. These advantages rarely appeared in dramatic battlefield narratives, but they determined which tanks actually arrived at the front and which sat immobilized behind it. When the war ended in 1945, the Sherman seemed destined for obscurity. The United States was already fielding heavier tanks and planning newer designs. Thousands of Shermans were sold to Allies, placed in storage, or scrapped. Officially, the tank was obsolete. No one expected it to return to frontline combat. 5 years later, it did. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with hundreds of Tu-34-85 tanks. These were formidable machines, arguably the most effective medium tanks of the Second World War, and American occupation forces in Japan were completely unprepared to stop them. Infantry weapons proved ineffective, and requests for armored support were met with an uncomfortable truth: there were no tanks available. In a frantic search, officers discovered fewer than 60 M4A3E8 Sherman scattered across Japan, many in poor condition. These late-war models, known as Easy-8s, had improved suspension systems and 76mm guns that had arrived too late to matter in Europe. Within weeks, hastily assembled crews shipped these tanks to Korea. No one knew how they would perform against Soviet-designed armor that had never faced American tanks in World War II. The result surprised nearly everyone. With improved ammunition, superior optics, and well-trained crews, the Shermans proved capable of destroying T-34s at typical combat ranges. More importantly, American crews often saw and fired first. In tank combat, that advantage is frequently decisive. Between the summer and fall of 1950, Shermans destroyed dozens of enemy tanks while supporting infantry at the Pusan perimeter. A tank declared obsolete 5 years earlier was once again fighting, and winning, against frontline equipment. Korea demonstrated a lesson that would repeat itself again and again in the decades to come. Under real combat conditions, training, logistics, and adaptability often matter more than raw technical superiority. But Korea was only the beginning. The true rebirth of the Sherman would occur far from American factories, in a country fighting for its survival with limited resources and no luxury of replacement. In the newly formed state of Israel, the Sherman story took a turn that no American designer could have predicted. The country emerged from the Second World War with almost no heavy industry, no domestic arms manufacturing base, and enemies on every border. Its survival depended on acquiring weapons by any means available and then keeping those weapons operational long after their intended lifespan. For Israel, the Sherman was not an obsolete relic, it was an opportunity. The first Israeli Sherman arrived not through formal purchase, but through improvisation bordering on theft. As British forces withdrew from Palestine in 1948, 1M for Sherman ended up in Jewish hands rather than being destroyed as ordered. The tank was incomplete and arrived without its main gun, but Israeli mechanics were unconcerned. They mounted a salvaged 75mm gun taken from another vehicle and named the tank May. It fought in the War of Independence alongside improvised armored cars and trucks armed with field guns bought on the international black market. This was not an armored force built according to doctrine. It was a force built from whatever could be found, repaired, or stolen. After the war, Israeli agents spread across Europe searching for surplus armor. In Italian scrapyards, they found dozens of early production Shermans left behind from the North African campaign. These tanks had been deliberately sabotaged for disposal. Engines were damaged, guns destroyed, and components removed to ensure they would never fight again. Israeli buyers paid scrap prices for hulks that appeared worthless. What they saw instead were raw materials. In workshops across Israel, mechanics stripped these tanks to their bare hulls. They salvaged what they could and fabricated what they could not. Engines were repaired or replaced. Guns were mounted from any available source, including 105mm howitzers intended for infantry support. No two tanks were exactly alike, but all of them worked. By the early 1950s, Israel operated several hundred Shermans in various configurations, forming the backbone of its armored forces at a time when the country faced existential threats. The problem was firepower. The Sherman's original guns, whether 75 or 76mm, could not reliably penetrate the armor of newer Soviet tanks entering service with Arab armies. Egypt and Syria began receiving T-34s and later T-54s from Moscow. Israeli planners understood that in a future war, their Shermans would be outmatched. Replacing them entirely was impossible. The nation lacked the money, industrial capacity, and political access needed to buy modern tanks in sufficient numbers. Modification was the only realistic option. In 1953, an Israeli military delegation visited France to evaluate the AMX-13 light tank. The vehicle itself was lightly armored and vulnerable, but its high-velocity 75mm gun impressed Israeli officers. The weapon was derived from German wartime designs and offered significantly better armor penetration than the Sherman's original armament. The idea that followed seemed absurd at first: mount the French gun in a Sherman turret. French engineers agreed to assist. They developed a modified turret capable of handling the longer gun and helped establish conversion procedures that Israeli workshops could replicate. In 1956, Israel began converting Shermans into what became known as the M50. The process required extensive modification. Turrets were altered, recoil systems reworked, and ammunition storage redesigned. Early models retained gasoline engines, while later versions received diesel power plants and improved suspension systems. By the early 1960s, roughly 300 Shermans had been converted. The M50 saw combat during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Israeli forces encountered Egyptian armor that included Shermans modified with French turrets of their own. World War II American tanks, upgraded with French weapons, were fighting each other in the desert while Cold War superpowers watched from a distance. The M50 performed well enough to validate the concept, but Israeli planners knew the upgrade was only a temporary solution. Soviet support for Arab armies continued to increase, and newer tanks with heavier armor were on the way. The next step was more radical. In 1961, Israel began developing the M51, armed with a French 105mm gun originally designed for the AMX-30 main battle tank. Mounting such a weapon in a Sherman turret required engineering creativity that bordered on reckless. The barrel was shortened to reduce recoil and length. A massive muzzle brake was added to manage forces the turret ring had never been designed to absorb. Ammunition was redesigned with reduced propellant charges, and the gun relied heavily on heat rounds, which did not depend on velocity for penetration. Against conventional expectations, it worked. The M51 entered service in 1962, and approximately 180 Shermans received the conversion. The tank that American factories had built for infantry support 2 decades earlier now carried anti-tank firepower capable of defeating modern Soviet armor. Israeli mechanics achieved this without access to original manufacturer blueprints or factory support. They relied on trial, error, and field testing, approving each modification only after it proved reliable under operational conditions. By the mid-1960s, Israeli Shermans bore little resemblance to their wartime ancestors. Massive muzzle brakes dominated their profile. Turrets sat higher than original specifications allowed. External storage racks, additional armor plates, and improvised fittings reflected each vehicle's individual history. They looked strange, but they worked. Crews trusted them because they had helped build them, repair them, and modify them repeatedly. On June 5, 1967, these modified Shermans went to war again. The Six-Day War would become one of the most decisive campaigns in modern military history. Israel faced roughly 2,500 Arab tanks with fewer than 800 of its own. In Sinai, the Battle of Abu Agala demonstrated what the rebuilt Shermans could accomplish. Egyptian forces occupied heavily fortified positions with minefields, anti-tank ditches, and armor dug in hull-down. Israeli units combined artillery, infantry, paratroopers, and armor in a coordinated assault. Modified Shermans attacked from multiple directions, their French guns capable of penetrating Soviet-era tanks at combat ranges. Within hours, Egyptian armored defenses collapsed. The route into central Sinai lay open, and Israeli forces advanced rapidly. Similar scenes played out on the Golan Heights and in the West Bank, where Sherman supported infantry operations and engaged Syrian and Jordanian armor. Against all expectations, tanks designed in the early 1940s were defeating machines built 2 decades later. The Six-Day War appeared to confirm the ultimate lesson of the Sherman's improbable survival. Training, familiarity, and intelligent use of equipment could overcome technical disadvantages. Yet beneath the victories lay warning signs that would soon become impossible to ignore. The warning signs revealed themselves 6 years later when the limits of improvisation collided with a transformed battlefield. On October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack during Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar. Israeli confidence, shaped by the overwhelming victory of 1967, collapsed within hours. This time, the Arab armies were prepared, coordinated, and equipped with weapons specifically designed to counter Israeli armor. Along the Suez Canal, Egyptian forces crossed using innovative engineering techniques developed with Soviet assistance. They breached the Bar-Lev line, a system of fortifications Israeli planners had believed nearly impregnable. On the Golan Heights, Syrian armored divisions surged forward in numbers that overwhelmed thin Israeli defensive lines. The attackers brought not only tanks, but new doctrines and technologies. Soviet Tu-62 tanks appeared with 115mm smoothbore guns firing fin-stabilized ammunition capable of penetrating armor at unprecedented ranges. Infantry units carried modern anti-tank guided missiles, allowing soldiers on foot to destroy tanks from distances where return fire was ineffective. Improved air defense systems limited the close air support Israel had relied on in earlier wars. Israeli armored units rushed to contain the breakthroughs. Modern Centurions and Pattons fought alongside reserve formations still equipped with modified Shermans. In theory, the M51's 105mm gun could penetrate Tu-62 armor using heat rounds. In practice, the battlefield had changed. Missile teams destroyed tanks before crews could identify firing positions. Long-range engagements favored the newer Soviet guns. The Sherman's armor, never intended to face such threats, provided little protection against modern kinetic penetrators and shaped charge warheads. Losses mounted quickly. Crews who had fought and survived in 1967 now faced opponents who matched their determination and exceeded their equipment. Tactical skill alone could not compensate for fundamental vulnerability. Israel ultimately survived the war through rapid mobilization, emergency resupply from the United States, and hard-earned tactical adaptation that eventually turned the tide. But the Yom Kippur War marked the effective end of the Sherman's frontline service with the Israel Defense Forces. The tank had finally encountered a battlefield it could no longer master through ingenuity alone. Yet the Sherman did not disappear. As had happened repeatedly before, it found new roles in unexpected places. During the Lebanese Civil War beginning in 1975, Israel transferred dozens of M50 Shermans to Allied Christian militias. These tanks fought in brutal urban combat that bore little resemblance to the open deserts of Sinai. Narrow streets, rubble, and close-range engagements emphasized survivability and firepower over mobility. Some Shermans were captured by opposing forces and used against their former operators. Tanks built to fight Nazi Germany now fought in the streets of Beirut for decades after their design. Far from the Middle East, the Sherman's afterlife continued in South America. In the late 1970s, tensions between Chile and Argentina escalated toward open war over disputed territory in the Beagle Channel. International arms embargoes limited access to modern equipment, leaving both nations reliant on aging armor fleets. Chile acquired M50 and M51 Shermans from Israel and further modified some with high-velocity guns capable of defeating contemporary tanks at practical ranges. Despite their World War II hulls, these vehicles carried firepower that could threaten any armored force in the region. Argentina followed a parallel path. Its army possessed British-built Sherman Fireflies armed with a powerful 17-pounder gun. In the 1970s, these were upgraded to the Repotenciado standard. The old gun was replaced with a French 105mm cannon similar to the Israeli M51s. Gasoline engines were replaced with diesel power plants, suspensions upgraded, and tracks adapted for local terrain. Two nations, independently and under similar constraints, arrived at nearly identical solutions: take an obsolete Sherman hull, install a modern gun, replace the engine, and keep it in service because no affordable alternative existed. In December 1978, both armies prepared for war. Sherman-derived tanks stood ready on both sides of the Andes, vehicles born from the same American design but transformed by different hands. A storm delayed Argentine naval operations, and international mediation prevented the conflict from erupting. The Shermans never fired at each other, but the fact that they might have if more than 30 years after World War II was remarkable in itself. Chile continued operating its Shermans into the early 2000s, while Argentine Repotenciados remained in service through the 1990s. Perhaps the most striking chapter came even later. Paraguay received a small number of Argentine upgraded Shermans in the late 1980s. These tanks served not on active battlefields, but with the Presidential Escort Regiment, participating in training and ceremonial duties. They remained operational until 2018. That date bears repeating. A tank designed in 1941, intended for a war that ended in 1945, was still in military service 73 years after its creation. The Sherman's extraordinary longevity forces a reconsideration of what makes military equipment successful. The tank was never the best in terms of armor, firepower, or mobility. German Tigers and Panthers outclassed it in World War II. Soviet T-34s and later T-54s and T-62s surpassed it in Cold War conflicts. Yet those tanks disappeared from service long before the Sherman did. The reason lies not in battlefield performance alone, but in design philosophy. From the beginning, the Sherman prioritized standardization and accessibility. Every Sherman used the same basic components regardless of where it was built. A mechanic trained on one could service any other. Parts could be scavenged, replaced, or fabricated without specialized equipment. When a German Tiger broke down, repair often required factory-level support. When a Sherman failed, crews could frequently fix it themselves using hand tools and determination. These qualities mattered enormously to nations with limited industrial capacity. After World War II, those same characteristics made the Sherman attractive to smaller states and irregular forces. It could be purchased cheaply, maintained locally, and modified using whatever components were available. Israeli mechanics demonstrated how far this adaptability could be pushed. Without factory support or official documentation, they mounted foreign guns, replaced entire powertrains, and altered suspension systems never intended for such changes. The Sherman became a platform for innovation rather than a fixed design. The tank's global journey also produced strange ironies. Shermans that once fought side by side later fought against each other. American-built tanks armed Arab armies and Israeli forces alike. Vehicles produced to defeat Germany became tools in conflicts across Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The success of the Sherman in World War II ensured its presence in wars its designers never imagined. By the late 20th century, the Sherman finally faded from combat roles. Museums preserved examples of Israeli M50S and M51S, Chilean upgrades, and Argentine conversions. These vehicles tell stories that specification charts cannot. They embody the reality that warfare is shaped not just by technology, but by people, mechanics who improvise, crews who adapt, and commanders who understand how to use what they have. The Sherman was never exceptional in isolation. It was adequate, reliable, and accessible. Those qualities allowed it to evolve far beyond its original purpose, surviving generations of technological change and remaining relevant long after supposedly superior designs vanished. By the time the last Sherman finally left military service, its journey had spanned continents, ideologies, and generations of warfare. No other tank design of the Second World War achieved a comparable afterlife. This was not because the Sherman was technologically superior, but because it embodied a philosophy that valued practicality over perfection. Its story is ultimately not about steel and guns, but about people, about how ordinary soldiers, mechanics, and engineers repeatedly found ways to extract value from equipment long after official doctrine declared it obsolete. Military history often focuses on revolutionary breakthroughs, thicker armor, larger guns, faster engines, advanced electronics. These elements matter, but they rarely tell the full story. The Sherman demonstrates that survivability in history depends just as much on maintainability and adaptability. A weapon that can be repaired, modified, and understood by those who use it will often outlast one that relies on specialized infrastructure and centralized expertise. The Sherman was forgiving. It tolerated rough handling, imperfect repairs, and unconventional modifications. That tolerance made it resilient in ways more advanced designs could not match. Consider how the Sherman's basic structure enabled repeated reinvention. Its turret ring, hull dimensions, and internal layout provided enough space and strength to accept weapons far beyond its original design. Its suspension could be upgraded incrementally rather than replaced entirely. Its drivetrain could accept engines never intended for armored vehicles. Each of these features allowed users to solve problems locally, without waiting for permission or support from distant manufacturers. In wartime and post-war conditions, that flexibility was invaluable. This explains why the Sherman thrived in environments where other tanks failed. Nations with limited resources could not afford frequent replacement cycles or dependence on foreign supply chains. For them, the ability to keep existing equipment operational mattered more than having the latest design. The Sherman fit that reality perfectly. It became a platform rather than a finished product, a foundation upon which successive generations could build. The contrast with more advanced tanks is instructive. German heavy armor dominated technical discussions during World War II, yet disappeared rapidly afterward. The same was true of many Cold War designs that seemed unbeatable in their time. Their complexity became a liability once factory support ended. Without specialized parts, trained technicians, and secure supply lines, their advantages evaporated. The Sherman, by contrast, remained functional precisely because it was never optimized to the edge of engineering limits. The tank's final years of service underscore this point. In Paraguay, Sherman served in ceremonial and training roles well into the 21st century. They were no longer expected to fight modern tanks, but they remained reliable, safe, and operational. That longevity is not accidental. It reflects a design that prioritized longevity before the term became fashionable. It also reflects the efforts of countless unnamed individuals who maintained these machines year after year. Museums now preserve Shermans in various configurations: wartime American models, Israeli M50S and M51S, South American upgrades, and obscure local modifications that exist nowhere else. Each vehicle tells a slightly different story, shaped by the needs and constraints of its users. Together, they form a record of how military technology evolves outside official design bureaus. They show how innovation often occurs not at the cutting edge, but in workshops where necessity forces creative solutions. The Sherman's legacy also invites reflection on how militaries evaluate success. If success is defined solely by dominance in head-to-head comparisons, the Sherman rarely qualifies. If success is defined by usefulness over time, adaptability across contexts, and accessibility to those who operate it, the Sherman stands nearly alone. It succeeded not by being unbeatable, but by being dependable and modifiable. This lesson extends beyond armored warfare. In many fields, systems designed for flexibility and maintainability outperform those optimized for peak performance under ideal conditions. The Sherman illustrates this principle in Steel and Fire. Its creators did not intend to build a legend. They intended to build something that worked. That modest ambition proved more powerful than they could have imagined. The tank's long service also reminds us that warfare is shaped by constraints as much as by ambition. Nations rarely fight with the equipment they want. They fight with the equipment they have. The Sherman served so many countries precisely because it could bridge the gap between aspiration and reality. It allowed armies to field armored forces when alternatives were unavailable, unaffordable, or politically impossible. In the end, the Sherman story is one of continuity rather than dominance. It links World War II to the Cold War, conventional battles to asymmetric conflicts, and industrial superpowers to small states struggling for survival. It demonstrates that the true measure of a weapon system lies not only in how it performs at its peak, but in how long it remains relevant when circumstances change. The Sherman was never meant to be remembered for 70 years. It was designed to win one war and then be replaced. Instead, it endured. It adapted. It survived in scrapyards, workshops, deserts, jungles, and cities. It served soldiers who were not yet born when its designers drew the first plans. That endurance was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate choices made long before anyone could foresee the conflicts that followed. When the last Sherman finally rolled out of service in 2018, it marked the end of an era unlike any other in armored warfare. A machine conceived in the early days of the Second World War had completed a military career spanning more than 7 decades. Few weapons in history can claim the same. The Sherman's legacy is not that it was the best tank. It is that it proved how far a good enough design can go when combined with human ingenuity. In a world obsessed with the next breakthrough, its story is a reminder that adaptability, simplicity, and determination often matter more than technological brilliance. That is why the Sherman kept fighting long after it should have been forgotten, and why it deserves to be remembered. The final significance of the Sherman lies in how it reframes the way history judges military technology. Too often, equipment is remembered only in comparison charts and battlefield duels, reduced to armor thickness, penetration values, or kill ratios. By those measures, the Sherman frequently appears mediocre. Yet history is not lived on spreadsheets. It is lived in mud, heat, dust, and scarcity, where the ability to keep a machine running can matter more than theoretical superiority. The Sherman thrived in that reality. Its endurance reveals the gap between design intent and operational life. American planners in the early 1940s never imagined the Sherman would still be relevant decades later. They expected it to be replaced quickly, perhaps even during the war itself. Instead, mass production flooded the world with thousands of hulls that became raw material for future adaptation. Once the war ended, these hulls did not vanish. They became the backbone of armored forces for nations that lacked the resources to start from scratch. This created a unique dynamic. The Sherman ceased to be an American tank in any meaningful sense. It became a global platform, shaped by local needs rather than centralized doctrine. Israeli Shermans reflected improvisation under existential threat. South American Shermans reflected geopolitical isolation and budgetary constraints. Asian Shermans reflected the realities of post-colonial armies building capability from inherited stockpiles. Each variant diverged further from the original design, yet all remained recognizably Sherman. That global spread also meant the Sherman accumulated an unmatched combat resume. It fought in deserts, jungles, mountains, and cities. It faced German panzers, Soviet armor, Western tanks, and infantry armed with missiles decades younger than the vehicle itself. Very few weapon systems are exposed to such a wide range of threats over such a long period. Fewer still remain operational through it all. Another overlooked aspect of the Sherman's success is psychological. Crews trusted it. They knew its limitations, but they also knew its behavior. Predictability in combat is valuable. A tank that responds consistently, even if imperfectly, allows crews to develop confidence and skill. The Sherman offered that consistency. Its controls were straightforward, its mechanical systems understandable, and its failures rarely mysterious. When something went wrong, crews usually knew why. This contrasts sharply with later generations of armored vehicles, which often traded simplicity for sophistication. Advanced fire control systems, sensors, and electronics increased combat effectiveness but also increased dependence on specialized maintenance and supply chains. When those chains broke, advanced vehicles could become unusable surprisingly quickly. The Sherman, by comparison, remained functional in environments where logistical support was minimal or unreliable. The tank's longevity also underscores the role of human creativity in warfare. No design survives for 70 years without continuous intervention. Every long-serving Sherman was kept alive by mechanics who fabricated parts, adapted civilian components, and solved problems with limited tools. Their work rarely appears in official histories, yet it was essential. The Sherman became a canvas for that ingenuity, a machine that invited modification rather than resisting it. In that sense, the Sherman was less a finished product and more an evolving system. Each generation of users added something: a new gun, a new engine, reinforced armor, improved suspension. These changes did not erase the original design, they built upon it. Over time, the Sherman became a layered artifact of military history, containing within it the solutions of many different eras. When historians examine preserved Shermans today, they are not just looking at a World War II tank. They are looking at a record of post-war adaptation. An Israeli M51 tells a story of survival against numerically superior enemies. An Argentine Repotenciado tells a story of technological self-reliance under embargo. A Paraguayan ceremonial Sherman tells a story of continuity and symbolism in a small army. Each one extends the narrative far beyond 1945. Ultimately, the Sherman story challenges the assumption that military relevance is short-lived. It shows that relevance can be extended when design choices favor accessibility and flexibility. It also shows that the value of equipment is inseparable from the people who use it. The same tank that seemed outmatched on paper repeatedly proved effective in the hands of crews who understood how to employ it within its limits. As warfare continues to evolve, the Sherman offers a quiet lesson. Not every solution needs to be revolutionary. Sometimes, the most enduring systems are those that accept compromise, that leave room for growth, and that trust users to adapt. The Sherman did not dominate history by force of technology. It endured by enabling adaptation. That endurance is why the Sherman remains more than a museum piece. It is a case study in practical design, a reminder that good enough, when executed intelligently and supported by human ingenuity, can become extraordinary over time. Long after newer and more powerful tanks have faded into obscurity, the Sherman's legacy continues to provoke discussion, not because it was perfect, but because it lasted. In the end, the Sherman did not just fight wars. It bridged eras. It connected generations of soldiers who shared no common enemy, ideology, or geography, yet relied on the same basic machine. Few weapons in history can claim such a role. That is why the Sherman story does not end with its last deployment. It endures as a lesson in how adaptability, simplicity, and human skill can give even an ordinary machine an extraordinary life.